Welcome to the first episode of The Quantified Body. I'm Damien Blenkinsop, your host, and I just got to say I'm really excited about this. I've been working on this project for a few months now, and I've already done a ton of interviews with great guests about all sorts of subjects which are really important to health, performance, longevity, all the kind of results we want in life, and using data and better decisions to get there quicker. So I'm really excited about this. Today, the topic we're going to look at is very practical. It's something for any of those of you out there who go to the gym, work out, training, and the topic is heart rate variability, also known as HRV. So the deal is that whether you're a professional athlete or you're just going to the gym, to work out and feel good, the fact is that recovery is a huge part of the results we get in the gym today, especially in this chronically stressed world where we're all not sleeping enough, we're not necessarily got the best diets, we're working too much, we've got many stressors, and life is just too fast in general. We're trying to squeeze too much in. So recovery is a pretty important part of getting the most out of our time in the gym, making sure that we're not digging a bigger hole for us, reducing our performance, reducing our well-being, rather than improving it. And a lot of people are aware of this now. However, even if you know this, and I know this for myself, when I've been training, I always felt like training more than was actually necessary. And so you still knock against this, I don't know if I'm recovered enough to work out today, and I feel like I should, so I do, and then, you don't increase your strength, you don't get better results. And so it can be difficult to figure out if it's the right time to hit the gym hard again and you're fully recovered. Enter heart rate variability. This is a really useful metric, and there's been a lot of research done on it about how you can use it to predict your stage of recovery and if you still need to recover before adding more stresses to your life. So a lot of professional athletes are using this now. And a lot of devices and apps have just started coming out over the last couple of years so that it's very easy to get access to this stuff and to use it. It's pretty cheap, it's pretty convenient. But there's lots of questions about how to use it, how accurate it is, which devices, which apps should you be using, what fits, what's proven by the research, what isn't, how can you actually use it to predict whether it's a good time to work out today or not. So, there's lots of questions around this, and I had tons of questions when I started, and so that's why I was looking for someone who really understood this area to interview. And I'm glad to say that I found someone via his blog, which is hrvtraining.com, which was the best resource I found on the topic, which goes the deepest. His name is Andrew Flatt, and he's a PhD student. He's been working in the Human Performance Lab at Auburn University on research related to HRV and exercise. He has been making use of HRV since 2011 himself to monitor and optimize his own training and that of the athletes he coaches. Some of those are professional athletes. He's also an accomplished athlete himself, so he knows all about this. He won the 2010 Canadian National Raw Powerlifting Championships. Andrew is extremely hands-on and has done a lot of the groundwork and, is pretty much submerged in his day-to-day. So it's really great to have both a practical and research-based perspective that he's going to bring to us today. To get the show notes, the transcript of the interview, and a whole bunch of other stuff about this episode, you can go to thequantifiedbody.net/episode 1. The Quantified Body. New technologies are bringing us more and better data on our bodies every day. This data promises to help us make better decisions for better health, higher performance, less disease, and greater longevity. In The Quantified Body, we explore this promise to find out where it is creating real-world results, improving bodies, and improving lives. Andrew, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's a great pleasure to have you on here.
Pleasure's mine, Damien. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. What I thought we'd do to start with is jump into what is HRV a little bit, heart rate variability, so that people who haven't come across this before can have a rough understanding of what it is and how it works.
Heart rate variability often gets confused with basic heart rate, which is measured in beats per minute. Heart rate variability differs by measuring the actual time difference between heartbeats. So from an electrocardiogram, we get R-to-R intervals, and from breathing patterns, there's variance between successive R-to-R intervals. And what heart rate variability is doing is capturing those changes between those heartbeats. So it's a little bit more specific of a measurement but it's not too dissimilar from basic heart rate. So people shouldn't get too confused with it.
So could you give me a quick overview? What is heart rate variability, HRV, and how do you use it? What is it all about?
Your resting heart rate is actually generally not consistent. We learn in a textbook that the heart beats every approximately 0.8 seconds for an average of 75 beats per minute. What that doesn't factor in is the actual changes in heart rate, subtle changes that in response to respiration, where when you breathe in, your heart rate actually speeds up a little bit. When you breathe out, your heart rate will slow down. And that's normal. That's called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And essentially what heart rate variability is capturing is those subtle changes in heart rate in response to respiration. So heart rate in beats per minute is kind of giving you that average of how many beats there were, whereas the variability is telling you how much variation there was between the beats. Now, there's various statistical procedures and so forth that we can assess variability. There's the standard deviation, there's the root mean square, there's spectral analyses. So there's various parameters for heart rate variability, but in a nutshell, it's just measuring the variance and changes between the time interval between heartbeats.
Right. And you brought up a little bit of terminology there. It's R to R intervals, which is basically R means the top of the beat, right? The kind of spike of the beat that you kind of see on the electrocardiogram. So R to R just means in between the time in between beats, correct?
Right, because they're such high peaks, it's real easy to measure the interval between them. So that's generally why the R to R intervals have been chosen. So.
Right. And just out of interest, why is it called an R? Why isn't it called a beat or?
The peaks are just alphabetically named. There's the P, Q, R, S complex, the T wave. So
okay.
It was just.
And the peak just happens to be the R. Good. So I know that you've been using HRV in a bunch of areas to basically make better decisions, mostly about training. Could you talk a bit about the different scenarios you've been looking at it with and where you found it most useful?
Well, I think it comes down to why I started measuring heart rate variability. I first learned about it just reading on some strength and conditioning forums, a website called elitefts.com. And there's some strength coaches talking about how they're using it with their athletes. So I kind of gained interest in it then. But it wasn't until I was preparing for a powerlifting competition. Training was going really well. I was pushing it real hard. I was set to set some personal records at a lighter body weight. When all of a sudden I took a planned deload, I actually got a little bit of a cold. I took a few days off from it, went back to hit the weights, and things were just feeling real heavy. And it was too close to competition for me to really fix things. And I actually ended up pulling out of the meet, and I was really disappointed. And, I thought to myself, there's got to be some kind of way that I could better manage my training and maybe kind of prevent this or see it coming a little bit better. So that was kind of the motivation to actually purchase a heart rate variability device and start using it. So my original motivation was to guide my own training. I'm involved in powerlifting, so it was kind of a selfish motivation more so than working with athletes.
Yeah.
But eventually that's kind of where it came to, where I would actually start using it with athletes I was training, friends and colleagues. I would get them using it and look at their data, and that's kind of how things went from there.
So you obviously found it very useful, to have gone into and start using this with other people now. So what kind of decisions do you make based on this? And is this the only indicator is it the main indicator you use with your training program and deciding when to, change up the variables?
When I first started using the device, I was very skeptical at first. I didn't know much about it other than what I read on the forums. And what I actually did was for 6 months, I used it and collected data, but I did not use it for any kind of decision making. In fact, I really didn't look at the trends or analyze anything until after about 6 months, when I would kind of look at the trend. I would look at my training log and I would try to see, what it was telling me in the first place. I think one of the biggest mistakes is people get a device, they think they know how to use it, and then they want to start making decisions with it. I think you almost want to do some kind of cross-validation with it on yourself first, and see what it's telling you in response to training or in response to, different kind of life events. You get sick, you travel. What is it showing you? Is it meaningful? And can that drive better decision making? And essentially what I found was after 6 months of using it, I would look back on it and, after heavy training sessions, I would see a decrease in my HRV score. Most noticeably, I would see after any kind of a new training stimulus. So, being involved in powerlifting, I wasn't doing a whole lot of conditioning work. But at the time I was doing my master's, I was working with a whole bunch of other people. in the weight room. I was a grad assistant strength coach, and they love to do conditioning on Wednesdays. So Wednesday morning, we would go and run these stairs. And man, it was tough for me, being a power lifter, not running since, I played football years before. And my HRV scores would just absolutely plummet after these sessions. But, after a few weeks, I would notice smaller and smaller, fluctuations in my scores. And it was kind of, reflecting that progressive adaptation to that training stimulus. So I thought that was kind of cool.
Right. So what kind of impacts do you say? So like once your score has plummeted, like what does that mean the next day? Like it's to say like, you start the day and you track your HRV and your scores plummeted. What does that mean like in terms of like how you're going to be feeling? And what does that mean in terms of how it's going to change the decisions you make that day?
So a low score can definitely be the result of a heavy training session. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. One of the great things about HRV is also one of its downfalls is that, it's a global marker, of stressors, whether that's physical, mental, chemical. So not always will you see a low score because of training. It could be brought on by other things. So you really need to be tracking other variables to really, make it a meaningful interpretation of what the data is telling you.
Right. So in the context of your training program, if nothing else changes, it's kind of like that, then it should be down to your training.
So I think one of the main things is you have to, are you an aerobic athlete? Are you an anaerobic athlete? Are you a team sport athlete? Depends on your training, because what heart rate variability is it's a reflection of the cardiovascular autonomic nervous system. And so it's for the most part, and especially within the research, it's predominantly been used with aerobic athletes, and that's kind of who would most benefit from it. I mean, resistance trained athletes at this point, it's all experimental to see what it is actually showing, but it doesn't necessarily reflect muscle soreness. It doesn't necessarily reflect muscle damage or your neuromuscular abilities for that day, your CNS kind of potential. It's a reflection of the cardiovascular autonomic nervous system, which is still a very important piece, physiologically for being prepared for training. So it is only one marker to consider, but I mean, the cardiovascular system is extremely important with, the recovery process, with removing waste products and so forth. So when the cardiovascular autonomic nervous system is kind of has rebounded back to baseline levels or super compensated to above, that would indicate that system is ready to go and is more likely to be in a more adaptive state to any kind of physical stress.
Right. So you mentioned that it's the autonomic nervous system. Another thing that we often hear is that it's an indicator of vagal tone. What does that mean?
So the autonomic nervous system, simply put, is divided into two branches. You have your sympathetic branch and your parasympathetic branch. The term vagal, is referring to the vagus nerve, okay, which is essentially the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, where you have parasympathetic innervation in the heart that essentially, any kind of physiology class, your professor will probably give you the car analogy where, when your foot is on the brake, the car is not moving. That's your rest and digest response. And, the autonomic nervous system is taking care of all the things that we don't consciously control. So our blood pressure, digestion, endocrine gland secretion, and so forth. And then when you take that foot off the brake, you have that withdrawal of parasympathetic or vagal activity. And then when you hit the accelerator, all of a sudden you get that sympathetic output, and that's going to actually increase heart rate and, prepare you for any kind of stressful events, whether it's exercise or, simple postural change from laying down to standing up. You got to pump blood to the brain so you don't pass out, and that's a sympathetic response. Right.
So, and another way I've heard it described is that basically your parasympathetic is trying to balance your system. So the vagal tone is the ability for you to balance and respond to stressors around you. Is that another way you look at it, or is that not correct?
Yeah. So essentially the sympathetic nervous system will be quite active during, physical stress like exercise. And then to recover from that, that's when your parasympathetic nervous system will help rebuild structures and repair the damage essentially that occurs during those stressful events. So that's why measuring your parasympathetic activity on a day-to-day basis is, a reasonably good indicator of your recovery status. If your body is still stressed, from training and you have a higher sympathetic output or even just parasympathetic withdrawal, you know that your system may not be fully recovered. Now, what I want to be clear is that that doesn't mean that you can't train, if your HRV is a little bit low. And a lot of these apps, that I think people need to understand is only measuring parasympathetic activity through a time domain measure called RMSSD. So that does not give you any indication of sympathetic activity. It's purely vagally mediated, so parasympathetic.
Okay. There's a couple of other terms you hear quite a lot is LF, low frequency, and HF, high frequency. As I understand it, like often they say LF is the sympathetic, the stressor, and HF is the parasympathetic relaxation. Is that true, or is it a bit more complex? And because some of the apps track, the LF and the HF as well, but some of them don't.
What you're talking about is they're called spectral measures from frequency domain analysis. HF generally does indicate parasympathetic activity. LF actually would be indicative of both parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. So it's not as clear as we'd like it to be, where HF is parasympathetic, LF is sympathetic, and it gives you an indication of sympatho-vagal balance, they'll call it. It isn't that clear. And one of the issues with the spectral measures that you're referring to is in terms of their practicality in field settings, they require longer measurement durations for valid assessment. These are less reliable markers on a day-to-day basis. It's kind of been recommended that RMSSD is the preferred parameter especially for convenience and for non-expert users in the field that just need a simple number that they could read and interpret real easily.
Yeah.
That's kind of, the RMSSD value is preferred for that.
Right. So is RMSSD the one that has the most research behind it?
Well, RMSSD is the reason why it's preferred is that it's a more reliable marker, very easy to calculate. I mean, if you have RR intervals, you could actually calculate RMSSD in Excel. It's a statistical measure, root mean square of successive R to R interval differences. That's what it stands for. It's consistent in paced or non-paced breathing situations, whereas HF and LF are going to be a lot more influenced by your breathing rate. So for in the field with athletes who may not be sticking to a certain breathe or respiratory rate or whatever, it's not going to affect your numbers as much. And lastly, I kind of got to it before, is it can be calculated in a relatively short time frame. In fact, you can get an RMSSD measure in 10 seconds. However, that generally isn't enough RR intervals to capture a real window of that autonomic activity. So actually part of our research was seeing, what is the shortest time frame we can measure HRV in with RMSSD. And, what we did was we found 60 seconds to be no different than a criterion measure, which has been established as 5 minutes. So we essentially randomly selected 60-second segments within a 5-minute ECG, and we found no differences. But when we looked at 30 seconds and 10 seconds, there was less agreement with the 5-minute measure. So our conclusions were that 60 seconds is probably enough time to get a valid HRV reading with RMSSD.
That's great. That's very short. Because a lot of the apps, you said there's this standard, I think that comes from the research, right, which is 5 minutes for a recording. But a lot of the apps now are looking at like 3 minutes or something like that. What kind of variance do you see across the apps? Have you seen any apps that go as low as 60 seconds, so makes it a little bit more convenient? Yeah,
there's some apps that iFleet is an app, for example, that uses a 55-second test. There's another app called HRV for training that actually allows you to select your test duration. So there's a 60-second option. I believe there's a 2-minute option, a 3-minute option. And then I think there's a device called Tink that I believe it's like a 40 or 45-second test. I use that briefly. And then the other apps tend to use a little bit longer. Now, the longer measurement is certainly not a bad thing to get a bigger sample of RR intervals for analysis. The issue comes down to, is the athlete or is the client, or are you willing to do that every day? If it's 2-3 minutes, that could be a little bit long. 55 seconds of 1 minute, that's generally not too bad. I find it more tolerable. The athletes I've used it with, generally can handle it. So it all comes down to preference, right?
Yep. Totally. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the apps, so I'd like to dive into that because, I know there's quite a few out there and there's a lot of them coming onto the market now. HRV's just started to become pretty popular. Basically, you're going to have a device for tracking your heart rate and you're going to have an app to go with it. Which ones have you looked at, and what are the kind of trade-offs and benefits of each? Have you got preferences and so on?
So I first started out with the iFleet app. That was the one I read on the forums that people were talking about. In fact, I think it was the only one available at the time.
So when was this, by the way?
This was 2011, early. Okay. I think around summer 2011 is when I actually bought it. Yeah. So that specific device at the time required a heart rate strap and a little ECG transmitter receiver device that you would actually plug into the headphone jack of your mobile phone. And again, it was a 55-second test, and I've stuck with that device. Actually, there's a few reasons why I stuck with it, but one being that it uses such a short measurement duration, and especially now that I've looked at the data, I'm quite confident that short of a duration is still going to give acceptable measures or more valid data. So I've stuck with that, but I have used others. I've done some beta testing for some people and looked at some other apps, and I mean, at the end of the day, you just want one that you're going to be able to use and that provides your data that's easy to interpret, nice visual trends help, whatever's more affordable for you. There has been some advancements in technology that allow you to measure HRV without an ECG receiver. Now you could just use a Bluetooth heart rate strap with some of these devices. There's previously or recently validated was a pulse wave finger sensor that iFleet is using, that you could literally, without any kind of heart rate strap, you just plug your finger into this little finger sensor device that's plugged into the headphone jack, and you can actually get your heart rate reading from the pulse out of your fingertip.
Right.
And
how accurate do you think that is? Because I use one of those for something called HeartMath, which is using HRV but in a different area, and that uses your ear, so it's collecting your pulse from your ear. But I find that every time I move in any little way, that it's messing with the signal, and it's not very clear. So do you find the finger sensor, because it's using light, right? It's pulsing light in to see what your heart rate is. Do you find that reliable?
Well, I think we have about 15 athletes where we looked at the pulse wave finger sensor, compared it to EKG. They were soccer players, male and female. We did supine and standing positions. Yeah, it was accurate. Great. It was more accurate in the supine position, but acceptable agreement also in the standing position. So we haven't published that yet. We want to collect more data on it. But yeah, I'm pretty confident in it based on the data that I've collected with it. Yeah. That's with the pulse wave finger sensor device. That's not putting your finger over the camera lens where the flash goes. That's not what we measured. So just to be clear.
Yeah. So if someone's getting one of these apps, what would be your suggestion? So all of them are using RMSSD, I'm assuming. I know the one I'm using, Sweetwater HRV plus a Polar H7 strap to get the heart rate with the Bluetooth that you mentioned earlier. I got an iPhone 5. So that works fine for me, and that was relatively cheap to get up and running with. I know that Sweetwater, for example, they take RMSSD and they modify it a little bit. They put it on this 1 to 100 index. Do the other apps modify this? Because I'm just like, is there compatibility problems later if you want to switch apps and you can't compare your score?
So Sweetwater, or the Sweetbeat app, I've actually experimented with. Now that, from when I used it, was providing various HRV parameters. It was giving you the HF, the LF, RMSSD, SDNN, numerous parameters of HRV, which is great if you know what those mean and how to interpret them. But I generally tell people to stick with, look at the RMSSD. Now, I know when iFleet started using a modified RMSSD value, what they essentially did was they log transformed RMSSD and multiplied it by 20. And that gives you, a figure on a 100-point scale. BioForce uses that value. I wasn't aware that Sweetwater or the Sweetbeat device did or not. I thought it was a raw RMSSD value, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I spoke to them one time, so it's definitely a modified scale version.
Okay. So then they probably use that value or something very similar. Now, not all apps use that value. A lot of, for example, the Omega Wave has a smartphone app, and they're using their own algorithm to come up with kind of a daily readiness score. So they're factoring in HF, LF, the HF LF ratio, RMSSD. So it's not one parameter that they use. So, there is difference among the apps and what they interpret. So it is something you probably want to look into.
Right. And yeah, you probably don't want to switch around too much once you've settled on one.
you find an app that you like. What's most important for the end user is, I think, the visualization of the data and how they could view it so that they could see, what their trend is like, how it's responding to their training. One of the things I really appreciate about the iFleet app is that it allows you to input your training load score. So depending on what kind of training you're doing or how you choose to quantify your training load, you have your RPE values, you can calculate tonnage for, weightlifting or powerlifting. You could do a trimp value for, endurance athletes, what have you. So you can input a training load value, and then it also gives you the ability to track your psychometrics, your perceived level of stress, sleep quality, muscle soreness, mood, nutrition. So there's a sliding scale for that you can kind of rate. So all of a sudden you have a device that isn't just tracking your HRV, but it's kind of monitoring several variables, which really makes interpretation of your HRV trend, more meaningful. I know Bioforce has an online system where you could go on, input your data, just kind of similar to the iFleet one. I'm not sure if you could do that from the app or not at this point, but it's a very similar system. So, that's another great product to look into. So when you are evaluating what app you want to use, you want to look at what additional features it has to offer, because an HRV score by itself is less meaningful without all this other information. So the more information you have and that you could, maybe attribute your changes and your trend to, better off you're going to be.
Right. Because I know for me, there's been a few times where I've had this huge crash and I've been wondering what happened. I didn't have any, big training session or anything yesterday. So it's definitely kind of like this, how would you say? It's this like little investigation sometimes. Why did my HRV crash? Have you, I know you've got some interesting stories about times that you've seen athletes or your own scores crash. What kind of things have you seen that influence it crash? And have there been any times where, you really didn't find any reason for it?
If we're talking a substantial decrease in your score, usually it's pretty easy to attribute it to something. Sometimes it's these smaller deflections where you're like, I'm kind of surprised it's that low today. That may be harder to attribute to something specifically. But you wake up with a fever, you're going to have some real low scores. Your heart rate's going to be high, and you're going to have some low scores. One of my coolest little anecdotes that I have with using an HRV app is, when I got real sick a couple of years ago over March break, and HRV I was able to use to guide my training to where I could start pushing it hard again and kind of get back to my normal routine. For a week, I had terrible symptoms. I had fever. I wasn't able to train. My scores were really low. Once my symptoms kind of subsided and I wanted to get back into training, what I was seeing was from very moderate workouts, pretty low intensity, something I would consider almost like a deload type of workout. These were causing pretty substantial decreases in my HRV. So I could see that my body, it was reacting to the training. It was, but it was quite stressful according to those scores. So I would actually continue to train relatively light until my scores wouldn't fluctuate so much. And that's when I would actually start pushing it harder again. And I could see in my trend that it wasn't as stressful. I wasn't seeing as big swings in my scores, and kind of able to use it to guide myself out of that situation where typically a meathead like me, I'll just start pushing the weight as hard as I can as soon as I feel ready, which may not have necessarily been the best thing to do at that time.
Right, totally. I've been in similar situations myself. I don't know if you ever, I had a score of 80 just recently, and it crashed to about 50. I don't know if that's something you see often.
Yeah, that's a big drop. And were you able to attribute that to anything, or?
Yeah, I've been suffering from a chronic illness, and it has something to do with that. So it's pretty serious. It's a pretty serious thing. It's not a typical thing. So, but in terms of someone a bit more normal, who's not dealing with kind of like medical issues or anything, what would a typical crash look like? Is it 20 points? Is it?
It's everyone's individual and unique. Every individual's data needs to be taken into context of what kind of training they're doing, how advanced they are, how trained they are. A more advanced endurance athlete, for example, will see smaller swings, more than likely. They will recover faster. Take an untrained individual, you put them through an intense workout, whether it's weights or conditioning, and they're going to see a big drop. And, that could last 48, maybe 72 hours. So every situation is unique, and every individual really needs to take some time to collect some data and observe how their trend is evolving in response to their training, because unfortunately you can't just say that this means that for everyone, because it's just not the case. And you really do have to maybe do some calculations with your data in Excel, looking at, the weekly mean value. You look at the variance within that week, and all that kind of analysis will give you a better indication of how you are responding to your training.
Right. So of course, like a lot of the other things that athletes look into when they're training are all sorts of lifestyle factors that could be affecting their recovery and how they're performing. I know that you've had many experiences with this. So like in one post you talked about like travel, and another you talked about going home for, was it Christmas or is it Thanksgiving, and seeing some stuff there. What kind of situations have you seen that, or like another guy went on spring break, I think, and he was partying a bit. What kind of situations have you seen that could be said like to be obvious, but what kind of things would you say to look out, and like, typical things that you've seen affect it?
Yeah, your lifestyle absolutely will affect your HRV responses. For example, working with a soccer team, we put them through a hard week of training. We see, pretty typical HRV responses, and then half of them go out on Saturday night partying and maybe having a couple of drinks, I don't know. And the other half maybe stays at home, gets to bed at a reasonable hour, and you can definitely kind of predict, who was out that night based on, those. Now, you definitely would need to do a little bit more investigation. You can't just, look at a score and say, oh, well, this person did this. But it does give you some kind of indication. Maybe you got to look into what's going on. Was it the night before a game? How are your athletes behaving? Not necessarily a tool to spy on anyone or anything, but it kind of will lead to some questions. Why isn't this person recovering? Why are their scores low? Are they getting sick? Are they staying up too late? Are they not getting enough sleep? So yeah, sleep is definitely one factor that will affect your score. Alcohol, if you're out drinking, you're definitely going to see some lower scores the next day. Like I said before, illness, your scores will definitely drop from that. In my experience, anytime I've gotten a cold or especially a fever, the scores drop. Now, you were referring to some of my older posts where I talk about, I actually went home to visit some family that I get to see, maybe once or twice a year. I actually had really high scores the next day. Is that the reason why they were high? I mean, I don't know. That's just speculation. But I mean, anything that you perceive to be very restful, whether that's sauna, you get a book, you read outside, you get some sun.
Yeah.
Something that you perceive to be restful and relaxation is generally going to, promote some of that parasympathetic activity and that restoration that we want to get. So I think it depends on the individual and their own personality for what they perceive to be regenerating and relaxing.
Yeah. Well, I've certainly, sometimes I'll take a specific day off and I'll say, okay, I'm going to recover this day because I need to, because my HRV's down. And it definitely pushes the score up. I've seen that many times. So like you say, the relaxation could be different for different people, but it definitely seems to impact the score if you take a day off and forget the work and all the other stressors. I don't know if you've seen examples of work stress figure into this.
I've seen some studies where I'm not as interested in that, so I don't pay too much attention. But yeah, there's definitely a stressful lifestyle, whether that's from work. You can have money problems. These are all things that can affect your autonomic nervous system, right? So it can be apparent in your HRV score. One thing I found is just within the literature, but also through trial and error, is some light aerobic work has a stimulatory effect on parasympathetic activity. So some active recovery can really help keep those scores up. In fact, just a few weeks ago, I was going through a kind of a work capacity phase where I was just trying to get in better shape, bring up my aerobic fitness a little bit. So after my resistance training sessions, I was doing 10 to 15 minutes on the bike. On off days, I was doing 20 minutes on the treadmill, or 10 minutes on the treadmill, 10 minutes on the rower, just trying to increase my fitness a little bit. And I've never seen anything like it in my trend before. I wasn't seeing any really big swings from day to day, even after like a heavy resistance training session, 5 sets of 5 with 80% plus. And, normally that would result in a lower score the next day. It appeared that these smaller aerobic sessions really attenuated those swings day to day. So I was seeing very little variance between my scores for that 2-week period. But then as soon as I stopped keeping up with that, I went back to my old fashioned, hard workout. You see a lower score and it takes a day or two to come back up. So it's interesting how much of an effect the light aerobic exercise has on stimulating that parasympathetic activity. There's there's definitely a threshold where too much or too intense and it's going to have the opposite effect. But a reasonably late session for not too long will generally has a stimulatory effect, and you'll see a bump in your HRV, 24 hours later or so.
Okay, so are you saying that, like, is that something that's going to help people, or is this just modulating the HRV, but it's not going to impact your actual recovery? So it's just modifying the number, but it's kind of hiding the fact that your HRV would have gone down?
Well, I think it comes back down to what your training goals are. So now after a heavy squat session and, I do some cardio, some light aerobic work after, and I don't see a drop in my HRV, that doesn't mean I'm going to be able to go squat heavy again necessarily. It's just saying that my cardiovascular autonomic, nervous system has rebounded back to baseline levels. So that system may be ready to go again. Again, it comes down to context. If you're more of an endurance athlete, it would probably be a better marker of when you're ready to train again. But with resistance training, there's, muscular damage that isn't necessarily reflected in your HRV. I mean, there's just not enough data yet to show that, an HRV score is related to any kind of nervous system potential for strength sports or power or anything like that.
That's interesting because, like, one of the things you mentioned was that when you're doing something new, some kind of new activity, some type of new training, that you see the, your score like crash down in particular in those situations. Now, is that do you think it's because of neuromuscular or metabolic adaptation that has to take place there, or what do you think that's down to?
Probably a combination of everything. You've introduced a novel stimulus that your body just hasn't necessarily adapted to yet or in a long time, so it's just harder to recover from. I don't have the answer for that. It hasn't really been, at least I haven't seen anything to explain why. That's just how it is. A novel stimulus, whether it's conditioning, resistance training, if you do a drastic change in your volume or intensity, from what I've seen, it's going to cause a lower score than typical. But with persistence in that new training modality or those methods, and you'll see that progressive adaptation, you'll see smaller swings after, the body kind of adapts to it. It gets more familiar with it. There's probably a better scientific explanation, but I just don't have it for you right now.
Great. So, I want to talk about recording, like how you record it, what kind of numbers you want to make sure you get, frequency, and so on. But just before that, how about baseline? Can you increase your baseline over time, or are we just looking kind of like at the dips and the highs and trying to keep it in the highs more, and kind of slacking off when we have more of the dips? Or are we able to actually influence this and in a way build more resilience over time?
Your lifestyle is going to change. Your training is going to change. Your training frequency. If you're a competitive athlete, that you have different seasons, different times, and then that's all going to affect your HRV because your training is going to change. You're not going to always be doing the same type of training. You might be doing less aerobic work in a different phase, and that aerobic work is really what stimulates those higher HRV scores. So if you're doing less aerobic work, you're going to see lower scores. And so you do have to take, whatever your baseline is, you got to take it into context for that training phase and your new training goals. You absolutely have to have an evolving baseline. A lot of the apps will use a rolling 7-day average, but generally at the start of a phase, you look at your first week, you look at the average, you look at the variance within that week. A simple value to use is called the coefficient of variation. It's just the standard deviation divided by the mean times 100. And that gives you a percent value of the variance, and see how it evolves from there.
So what do you use the COV for?
So the coefficient of variation is so you have a weekly mean value, which is just the average of a 7-day period.
Yeah.
That average doesn't necessarily indicate or reflect how much fluctuation existed between those scores on a day-to-day basis, right?
Yeah.
So we want some kind of value or figure similar to a standard deviation of how much variance there was, because let's just say your average between 2 weeks is no different, but you have much more fluctuation in 1 week than the other. Well, that could be indicative of, some positive adaptation, or, I have a case study that we did with a cross-country endurance athlete that should be published one of the next editions of the Journal of Australian Strength and Conditioning. And we actually found that his CV value, the coefficient of variation, was much more related to his endurance performance than his weekly mean value. And we get into, possible explanations why in the paper. Yeah, the variance is important,
So you want less variance, which means that your system's dealing with the different stresses and the changes more easily.
I don't think it's not a matter of, I think it's maybe when you want that. I mean, if you're seeing big fluctuations in your scores, That's not a bad thing. That's your body adapting and adjusting to the training. But
Okay.
it probably means that you're not in the best state to compete at your best or to perform at your best, because your body is, it is adapting and it's going through the stress and recovery phases. But all of a sudden, you've been doing that training for a while, you see less fluctuation in your scores. There's maybe less, it's not the same amount of stress as your body initially perceived it as and had to recover from. You may be in a situation where your performance, you may be at a higher level of performance. Again, that's,
it sounds like, a COV low variance could be an indication that you've adapted to whatever stimuluses you're giving yourself. What kind of, that could be lifestyle or it could be training. And in another situation, if it is pretty high, it could mean that, something different is going on and your body's adapting to it. And it could be, if it's got high variance, it might be a good thing. If you are going through new training sessions, it's showing that your body's going through that adaptation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I need to point out is I started using the CV value after reading a case study by Daniel Plews and Martin Boucher and all those guys that are, the experts in this area. And what they found with the CV was in an overtrained high level endurance athlete, I believe it was the CV was related with the progression of overtraining. So when you're looking at any kind of value, whether it's the mean or the CV, you really need to look at the training load. You need to look at their perceived levels of fatigue and stress to really give more meaning to that value. So again, a high HRV score, an increasing trend can also be indicative of overtraining, and mostly in endurance athletes. So you kind of have to look at these other factors. The HRV scores alone aren't going to tell you much without all this other information. So the CV, whether it's good or bad or whether we want it or not, depends entirely on the context of that training and what's going on with the athlete and how far we are from competition. So there's no such thing as, we want this. I mean, maybe in certain phases we want this, but it's all relative to the individual and to the training. So right. Everything needs to be factored in.
If you take two athletes or perhaps an athlete and a non-athlete and you compare their HRVs, kind of like their 7-day average, right? So getting their baseline. Are they going to be different? Is the athlete's going to be higher? And is that going back to your baseline, is that something we want to be higher and we should be trying to get higher over time? Is it possible?
I mean, the average person, just for the cardioprotective benefits of having a higher parasympathetic activity at rest, definitely generally higher HRV is a good thing. If you take a team of athletes and you have them monitor their HRV, you're going to get different scores. In a group of female soccer players that I worked with over this past season, their average scores range, from the low 70s up to a couple girls were, pushing 100. There's a genetic factor here. There's lifestyle, there's fitness. So all these things come into play, but you can maybe generalize that, an endurance athlete who's going to have a very low resting heart rate is going to have higher HRV, which could be, in the 90s plus. Anaerobic athletes can be between that 70 and high 80s, depending on their fitness levels. So you can maybe say that this is where the average would be for this type of athlete. But right. In my experience, everyone's kind of had their own trend and their own response to training. Similar responses in terms of, the fluctuations and following a heavy training day and whatnot. But you're not going to get a team of soccer players with everyone's score being 90 and similar changes. Everyone's different, and you should plan accordingly for that.
Right. So someone in their 60s, is that okay? Or someone in their 50s?
Well, I mean, that's I would ask, is that being measured in a supine laying down position, or is that a standing value? Right. That obviously makes a difference.
Okay, let's get into that then, because I know you take both readings, correct?
Well, I experimented with both.
Yeah.
I've been sticking with standing. I've been doing standing since day one, but I did experiment for a little bit. Actually, at different time points, I experimented with supine readings as well. But you want to get into...
So, yeah. So, I mean, supine, just for the guys listening, that just means you're lying down. So, you're taking, readings when you're still in both situations, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so we're getting into the recording methodology here. It's like, how do we go about actually taking these readings, and when would you do it to get, reasonable results? I take it, for instance, every morning when I wake up, I'll go to the toilet and then I'll take the lying down one and I'll stand up and I'll take that. I have to let it rest for a little while when I stand up. So I'll stand up for about a minute and then I'll take the reading. So you can tell me if that's like correct or not. I seem to get relatively stable readings. How do you go about it now, and what kind of things have you discovered that are good and bad and help to get an accurate reading, and what kind of things do you need to avoid?
This is interesting. The general guidelines are a supine measurement where you record the last 5 minutes of a 10-minute segment. So you're essentially have what is often called a stabilization period, where you let your heart rate adjust to that position. And so that's generally a 5-minute period followed by a 5-minute recording. With the research that I've been doing, Auburn, with Dr. Michael Esco, is trying to investigate shorter, more convenient HRV recording procedures, because one, we wanted to do research with these smartphone apps, but we weren't entirely sure if we were going to be able to publish anything without any kind of validated shorter measurement procedures that we could say, we did a shorter measurement recording, we had a shorter stabilization period, but that's not necessarily a problem, because it's not really showing any differences to these accepted standard measurement procedures. So as I kind of mentioned before, we found that 60 seconds was a suitable duration for an RMSSD measurement. We have a new paper that's currently in review where we looked at, how long does the stabilization period need to be, at least in a supine position. So we looked at standard measurement, 5 minutes following a 5-minute stabilization period. And we just looked at if each individual minute, minute 1, minute 2, 3, 4, and 5, were those values any different to the 5 to 10 minute segment. I'm not going to get too much into the results, but we're pretty confident that we can get away with a shorter stabilization period, much shorter than what is traditionally recommended. And again, we're just looking at capturing a resting measure. We're not using this for clinical diagnosis or anything like that, right? So healthy populations and athletes where we just kind of want to get a general indication of their heart rate variability that day. We don't need a whole 10-minute procedure.
Yeah. So what statistical variance we're talking about between yours and the 5-minute one? Is it like a 5% difference, or?
Are we talking about the stabilization or the 60 seconds?
Yeah, if you do your shorter version, which is what is it 1 minute and 1 minute, or?
So let's just say that you use a 1 minute stabilization period and then a 1 minute test. I mean, yeah, you're trying to get me to get into the results, which I shouldn't do until it gets published. But
okay. Well, just a rough idea. You said it's okay, right? So don't give me a statistic, but yeah.
Let me put it this way: it would be trivial. There's, that's a term we use with a statistic called the effect size, which is telling us how practically meaningful the difference is. I say that the shorter stabilization period, as opposed to the traditional one, you would probably see trivial differences. I could tell you within the literature, a 5-minute HRV recording has been used following only a 1 minute stabilization period, and that's been used in elite endurance athletes, and the data was still providing very meaningful information pertaining to training status. So again, a shorter stabilization period, 1 minute, it's been used. So I would say go ahead and use the 1 minute stabilization period.
Right. So I mean, it sounds like it's reasonable to do a 1 minute stabilization and then a 1 minute with the app. Depending on the app, they do different times automatically, of course. But you think that would be okay for some guys at home who want to use this for training and so on?
I mean, absolutely. With the athletes I've worked with myself, and then with the data that we collected and looked at, 1 minute is not very different from the 5-minute value. So yeah, I'm quite confident in that shorter measurement with RMSSD specifically.
Great. So what other things are you still taking the lying down, the supine, and the standing? And of what we just spoken about, the 1 minute, is that fine for both of them?
After a postural change, you're going to want to, what happens is in a supine position, your heart rate doesn't really need to work as hard to pump blood to the brain. Then when you stand up, all of a sudden, you have receptors that are going to detect changes in blood pressure, and this happens real quickly, but essentially your heart rate's going to shoot up real high immediately following a postural change. And then it actually takes longer than a minute to actually stabilize. But in the research, 1 minute following that postural change is when they'll start recording HRV in the standing position. Going back to why I like the standing measurement is simply because what's happening is you're introducing a small stressor to the body that it needs to adapt to. Okay, it's called an orthostatic stress. It's just, that standing, you stand, you put that little challenge on the heart where it has to react to the postural change. And then you kind of essentially are evaluating how your heart is responding to that. If your heart rate variability is very low, after you've given your heart rate time to stabilize, that may be a better indication of how your body is going to respond to physical stress that day.
Right.
That's kind of the working theory. And that's nothing new. I'm not sure if you're familiar with what's called the Rusko test, where you start by measuring your heart rate laying down, then you measure it following a postural change at different time segments, and you're trying to see, what the changes are between those. So it's not a new concept. It's certainly nothing that I could take any kind of credit for. But I did experiment with taking supine and standing measures and just seeing how it related to my previous day training. This kind of little N=1 experiment, I've always found that the standing position provided a better reflection of my perceived level of recovery yesterday's training. Now, that's not a very scientific method. I didn't take any blood markers or anything like that, but just from visualizing the trend, I see, what the standing position looks how it should based on how I'm feeling and what training was like the previous day. So I pretty much stuck with it.
Okay.
Now, I think.
So now do you use just the standing, or do you use both?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. My preferred position is seated or standing. I do standing just because it's practical. You wake up, you go pee, you're already standing. I plug in I use the finger sensor now. So I plug in the finger sensor and I do my measurement right there in the bathroom. It's just easy. The seated position, is also, would be similar, providing that you're obviously gonna have to sit up. There's gonna be that little orthostatic or that, that seated up, more vertical position challenge. So the seated position is probably, I wouldn't think would provide significantly different data, in terms of at least the trend. The number value might be different, but the trend would probably be the same.
Okay. Do you see more variance and slightly lower numbers for standing versus supine? Lying down? Yeah.
Absolutely. The supine values are going to be much higher. I have data in the soccer team that I've been working with. I had them do supine and standing measures because that's a question I've always been very interested in. What is the better position? Kind of some preliminary analysis on the data. I think what we're seeing is that, without getting too much into the results, I think supine and standing may be potentially indicating some different information, where supine may be related a little bit more to fitness and standing may be more related to the acute changes in response to previous day training. Again, that's very preliminary. We still got a lot of analysis to do, but from that data, that's kind of what I'm seeing from my personal experience.
So what you're saying is like lying down is kind of like your baseline, and like standing is what's been going on the last week in terms of what you've been up to and you've been exposed to in terms of stressors.
Possibly. It's hard to draw any kind of conclusion, but I mean, in the supine position, there's in very, very fit athletes, there's been issues of parasympathetic saturation, but all of a sudden you sit up or you stand up and you kind of eliminate that issue. So I know in a recent paper by Stanley, Peake, and Boucher, where it was in sports medicine, and they reviewed the literature on parasympathetic reactivation after exercise, and one of their recommendations was to measure in a seated position. I would definitely recommend anyone, especially exceptionally fit athletes, any endurance athletes or some really fit athletes, soccer players, rugby, what have you, with really low resting heart rates. I would definitely do either a seated or a standing position. For less fit individuals with higher resting heart rates, supine position may be fine. That's that's a gut instinct that I don't necessarily have a ton of data to support that. So take with that, take that how you want to.
Okay. One of the few of the other things is just to make sure that there's no other confounding variables coming in here. Do you have to make sure this is at the same time of day, or is it irrelevant?
Yes. So actually, I meant to get into some of this stuff. You definitely want to be consistent with your measurement procedures. One of the best recommendations is, you have to remain as motionless as possible. It's funny, you collect ECG data in a bunch of athletes and you're reviewing it and you see some funny things and you're like, man, what were they doing in there? And one athlete had a bit of a cold at the time, and we could see her sneezes in her RR interval trend, on the tachogram. We could see when she sneezed. We could see when athletes maybe moved positions or adjusted their position. And, this all is going to affect your heart rate. I looked at an ECG trend when the investigator walks into the ECG room or the lab, and just that kind of startles the subject, or it might not startle them, but it does provoke a heart rate response, and all that can affect your heart rate variability information, right? So you want to be as undisturbed as possible. You want to limit any kind of noises. You want to limit, anything that can be distracting. You obviously, you don't want to necessarily check your emails or messages first thing before you do it, because that can create some anxiety based on, work related issues or, anything really. So you definitely just want to wake up, do your business in the bathroom, empty your bladder, and do your measurement, whether you do it seated or standing, or if you choose to go lay down again, or if you choose to just do your measurement right in bed right after you wake up.
Yeah.
Consistency is the most important. Definitely limiting the noises, like I was saying. Time of day is actually that's a research question that we have, and that's something we want to answer. There's definitely going to be circadian rhythm effects. So if you do a measurement at 7 a.m., it's definitely going to be different by noon. But is there a difference between a 7 a.m. and 9 a.m.? If you're within a reasonable time? We've been asked by some professional NFL teams, can they bring their athletes into the workout facility, have them lay down on a training table and do their HRV then, as long as they control for all the other variables? My assumption is that, that's not going to be the same information you're getting from a waking measure, but how different is it? And can we still get some meaningful data from that? I don't know. That's something we definitely want to look into.
Right. So, I mean, like the whole thing about doing this first thing in the morning is it manages to eliminate a lot of, potential confounding variables, like what's going on in your environment, what you've been doing in the morning, anxiety, and all of these other things.
Yeah. I mean, apart from sleep, it's going to be your most rested state, right? So
yeah,
that's the ideal time to do it.
So some of these apps, they autocorrect for things like arrhythmias, errors, artifacts, ectopic beats, a bunch of things which are kind of noise. Would some of them, like I know the Polar H7 kind of automatically does that. I'm guessing that some of the others do. Does this eliminate these kind of things we're talking about to any extent or not?
Yeah, I mean, at least because we did a cross-validation with the iFleet device, we looked into how it goes about interpreting the data. And it actually, that device in particularly has thresholds for R-to-R intervals, where they basically, the average highest range for an R interval versus the lowest range. And if you get a series of R intervals that kind of exceed that threshold, either above or below it, it's going to correct for it, with the adjacent normal cycle. So a lot of these apps will have built-in irregular beat detection systems. Again, whether it's the R interval is way longer than average or way shorter than average, it'll essentially pretty much red flag that as an irregular beat or an artifact or what have you, and correct for it. So, and that's a limitation of a shorter measurement. If you're doing a 55-second test and if you experience a couple ectopic beats, generally within a 1 minute period, you shouldn't be experiencing more than one. But, the shorter measurement duration, that's a shorter series of RR intervals. There's more room for error in that situation. But like I said, there is that irregular beat detection function. When we've looked at, I think we had 25 athletes where we compared to the ECG. I mean, it was accurate. So, in that small sample of people, there wasn't any issues.
Great. So is there anything else in terms of recording that you have to be careful of to make sure that the data is useful, accurate, and so on?
I mean, I think the key is that you want to be able to do this every day, and you want to do it consistently for meaningful data analysis. The key is to make sure you do it and you're consistent in your environment, very consistent in your position. You don't want to stand one day and do it seated the next day, then supine. If you want to experiment, you got to, when you do a measurement, save it in your preferred position and, just log your other position measurement. You don't want to save that so that it affects your trend line by any means. So the key is being consistent in your position. Be consistent with if you choose to do the paced breathing. Some of these apps provide a lot of them will use 7.5 breaths per minute, which was kind of what was the mean breathing frequency of a group of endurance athletes. That's kind of where that value came from. Just be consistent. Don't do paced breathing one day and then not the other. Shouldn't have too much of an effect with RMSSD, but you want to be as reliable as possible with your procedures. So either do spontaneous or paced breathing, pick one or the other, stick to it, stick to the same position. I'm not going to lie, I don't necessarily measure at the same time every day. I mean, my lifestyle changes, I'll be able to sleep in certain days. I might have to be up super early one day. I do it when I wake up. I mean, that's just the way life is, right? If you want to, some people take it pretty seriously and they wake up at the same time every day. That's great. That would probably be more reliable, but you got to be reasonable.
Yep, great. So what I do, for example, is I track it every single morning, and I'm looking for either acute drops, like big changes to take notice of. Otherwise, I'm kind of looking mostly at the 7-day average. How do you approach this? Like, ideally, I want my 7-day average to go up, like over time, and so that I can feel like I'm getting somewhere with things. How do you look at it? Like, what's most important? Are you looking mostly at the 7-day average? Are you looking at the the day by day? What are you using most in your actual decisions?
Well, I like to look at everything. I like to see the acute change, what happened between today and yesterday. I do not, generally, at this point in time, I do not use a daily change to be a huge determining factor in my training, specifically because I'm more of a resistance training athlete. I'm involved in powerlifting. So an HRV score isn't necessarily indicating, if I'm going to be stronger or anything like that. But I do take a look at it and I see, and I always like to compare it to, what happened the previous day. What I like to do is look at the weekly average and the variation of the previous week, and just to see how that corresponds to my training plan. If I had a higher volume week where I was trying to create some fatigue, I would expect to see a lower average, maybe some more variation, and go from there.
But if you didn't, you might say, okay, I've been under training and I want to push that a bit harder this week. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, you can use that to guide how you may structure your next training cycle. Again, it really does depend on what kind of athlete you are, but for resistance training purposes, I just do a lot of personal experiments. I went through a phase where I was using the acute changes to guide my daily training. So rather than taking I would work 3 weeks harder and deload every fourth week. I stopped doing that for a bit, where I would just reduce training loads on a day with a low HRV score, should that happen on a training day. Training like that was fine. I made reasonable progress. I didn't find that not deloading was an issue every fourth week, by just taking off a day here and there or reducing loads. That was fine. The issue is, if you really want to make any kind of marked improvements, you're going to have to do some overload training. And if you're going to overload training, you're going to accumulate some stress, and you're probably going to see a decreasing trend in your HRV. And that's generally not a huge issue. You just want to be mindful that you're starting to accumulate some fatigue, and how long you want to persist with that. You want to pay attention to soft tissue issues. Are you getting a lot of inflammation? I would get some tendonitis in my elbows and so forth. So you use it as a guide, but you take it with other parameters as well, like I was saying before. So
yeah,
again, an endurance athlete would be a little bit different. I would actually probably use HRV, the acute changes. I'd probably use that a little bit more to influence my daily training, just because it's been shown that, HRV guided training with endurance athletes, based on your parasympathetic activity, you're maybe in a more favorable position for training for endurance exercise. So again, it all comes down to what kind of athlete you are, what kind of adaptations you're trying to create.
Yeah, great. So looking at potential alternative metrics, another thing that people use a lot is resting heart rate. Is that something you would use as well, or do you find HRV better, or is it ever worth like taking both and looking at them in conjunction, or do you think, what have you done, or do you have no experience with the resting heart rate?
Well, I think resting heart rate is a little bit more crude of a measure.
Okay.
That is now, because though it is a little bit more crude, it can still be very effective. In fact, if you look at your RMSSD trend against your heart rate trend, they'll generally be a nice inverse relationship between them, where they'll kind of mirror each other. Now, I personally don't monitor both. I mean, if you don't have an HRV device, I would definitely do heart rate. I mean, that's something you could do, just measuring your pulse every morning. In my experience, I just use the HRV value. What I want to do with the data we collected in the soccer team is to see if did heart rate variability provide more meaningful information than basic resting heart rate alone. Do we even need heart rate variability, even though it can be more specific of a measure? Is it necessary? I don't think that people need to dismiss heart rate and think that it's not useful, because it absolutely is. There's been good data on it. And again, your heart rate variability trend with RMSSD isn't going to be too dissimilar from your resting heart rate trend. They're just kind of inversely mirrored,
Yeah. Actually, a couple of things I kind of confounders I forgot to look at, but I think are important. Age and your gender. Do they influence?
Absolutely. What you'll find with individuals approach middle age or they start to get a little bit older, there's going to be a natural decrease in parasympathetic activity. However, that can be changed with training. So if you're doing regular aerobic work, you can mitigate those decreases and have reasonably high HRV on a regular basis. However, I would assume that would change should you stop keeping up with that kind of training.
Right.
But absolutely, generally what you'll see is older individuals will have lower resting heart rate variability. Females tend to have, if you have two sedentary individuals, the female will generally tend to have higher. That's not always the case. In our data, we looked at 20 endurance athletes, 10 males, 10 females, and their resting heart rate variability was not statistically significantly different. So we compared them as a group rather than by gender. So if you're endurance trained, you're going to have higher heart rate variability generally, whether you're male or female. But when you remove the training factor, females will generally have a higher resting heart rate variability versus males. But again, that's not always the case. But generally.
I'd like to talk a little bit about where's this all potentially going? Like what can we in the future? Are we going to be able to do different things with HRV? Because I do know that it's getting more popular. There's more apps and devices coming out. What do you see happening with HRV over the next 5 years? Do you see any getting more sophisticated? A lot more people using it in different areas? What do you kind of see?
Well, I mean, definitely in the clinical setting with regards to cardiac rehab, guiding training of individuals who have had cardiac events and so forth. That's not my area. I'm not as interested in the clinical side, but kind of where a lot of this came from and started. So I think there's going to be a lot more usage of HRV in those situations, especially when we have, validated mobile technology where you can acquire a resting score in a reasonably short period of time. I see it growing there. One way that I see it being included in athlete monitoring is with a reduced requirement, a lower frequency of measuring. So, for example, there's a recent paper that showed that less frequent measures of only 3 times per week was suitably reflective of the weekly mean value. So it didn't necessarily need the 7-day values. You could get away with 3 when you're looking at the average. One thing we're looking at with our data in the soccer team is, how few days can we measure HRV where the mean value and the coefficient of variation are no different. So I think when we get more data on that and we start to realize that you don't need to measure HRV every day if you're looking at the means and the CV, it becomes more practical and they're affordable, right? It was previously cost prohibitive to measure HRV. You needed either an ECG or, an expensive device. You needed an experienced and qualified technician to operate the device or the machine and then interpret it. Now, within 2 minutes or less, you can get an HRV score. An athlete can take it home and figure it out. It's real easy to do. Interpretation with the visualization and these other factors, it's becoming a lot more easier to use. And so it's becoming more feasible for people. It's more affordable. So I see it being definitely more widespread in sports, especially, for any endurance athletes or soccer teams that currently aren't using it, which there's definitely plenty. But I think the more evidence that comes, the more likely they will be to use it. Even the fact that we can now acquire HRV with a finger sensor makes it a lot more practical for an athlete to wake up and do the measurement. You think about it, 1 minute test, that's not that hard. Come on. But you'd be surprised how many athletes just can't seem to do it every day. So reducing the measurement requirements to fewer days per week and making it easier to acquire the data, that's just going to increase the usage of it, I believe. It will at least increase the research, where we'll have more data to see, okay, is it even worthwhile using in a soccer team or a football team and what have you? There are other areas where HRV is being used, the biofeedback where you're adjusting your heart rate, trying to increase your HRV prior to, there's been studies we're looking at baseball batting, golfing to see if it affects how accurate they are with their putts and so forth. So that's not an area I'm involved in by any means, but that's where it is used. So
right, I've seen that it's some people have been connecting that to the flow state, which they say is the high performance state. So the idea was that a higher HRV would mean that you're accessing your flow You're more in a flow state than having a lower HRV. So I think that's some of the thinking around that. Don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at some papers. My interest has always been in, a resting measure and how it relates to performance and fatigue and so forth. That research is progressing, so who knows where that's going to evolve. But again, it's just a matter of having more data, more published data to show that this is how it can be used. I mean, we're pretty clear that it is pretty effective, but how practical can it be in the applied setting with a team of athletes and so forth is the next question.
So where is a lot of the research on this? In which journals do you find it? Are there in some specific journals, or is it kind of scattered around? And have you seen it increasing over time?
There's definitely been an increase in the amount of research on heart rate variability, for athlete monitoring purposes and so forth. Just to name a few journals, you're looking at International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance. There's been some in the European Journal of Applied Physiology. I mean, every month there's one or two papers in, a lot of these sports science journals every month that pertain to heart rate variability. Journal of Sports Sciences, European Journal of Sports Science, Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. So yeah, I kind of go through these every month and see what's being recently published. You can get on Twitter and follow a lot of these researchers and interact with them, and they'll sometimes give a heads up on what's coming, and you could discuss it with them. Attending conferences, you kind of can see what research is upcoming, what's being done, and in fact, that's how I got into all this. I attended the National Strength and Conditioning Association, their national conference in 2012, and that's where I met my colleague who I've been working with for the last year or two, Dr. Michael Esco. He was presenting a poster on HRV. He was the only one there doing any HRV research. He was living in Alabama. I was living in Toronto. We hooked up. Next thing I knew, I was moving to Alabama, and we started doing research together. So that's
great. So who else this might be? You might have kind of already answered this. I know you mentioned a few names, but who besides yourself would you recommend to follow to learn more about HRV and this biometric?
Well, definitely Martin Boucher. Yeah, you could find him on Twitter. Daniel Plews, who worked with Dr. Martin Boucher. Jamie Stanley, another guy who's been producing some great HRV research. Fabio Nakamura, Joel Jameson, who kind of runs the BioForce system and the 8 Weeks Out website. The iFleet has a blog where they, discuss HRV research, and maybe they have an endurance athlete that posts a training log. I try and post some data, some new research here and there. So yeah, on any of those social media sources like Facebook or Twitter, you could generally find some of these individuals. Great,
thanks. That's a lot of good references there. So, and of course, is your blog, which is hrvtraining.com.
Yeah, I try and update it every once in a while. Things get busy, so I'm not as religious with it as I used to be. But the whole purpose of that was to just share data, and there wasn't much talk about it, and I wanted there to be. So that's kind of where it started, and now it's evolved to I'll discuss some of our new research projects and post some new research. But it kind of was started with just posting data and then trying to analyze it and leaving it open for discussion. So if you're interested in looking at some previous trends of my HRV or HRVs of athletes, where we discuss and analyze the data and try and come up with a meaningful explanation or some research review, you can check out the site. I should warn you that a lot of the older posts, I kind of reread some of them recently, and they make me cringe.
So isn't that always the way?
Take it with a grain of salt when you read the older posts. I've learned a lot since I started. I've learned a tremendous amount. So yeah, just be aware that some of the older posts may not be a current reflection of my thought process these days.
Of course. Coming back to kind of a more general view, in terms of you personally, what would be your top recommendation to someone trying to make better decisions about their body's health or performance with data?
You need to select what monitoring variables you're going to monitor, and you need to be consistent with them. And you need to do a lot of trial and error. You need to almost separate yourself from the data, collect the data, analyze it later with your training logs and see what it's telling you. If a training variable isn't meaningful, if you can't figure out why you're measuring it or what it's telling you, then you probably don't need to do it. You want something. So for example, with me in the resistance training, I'm continually experimenting with HRV. There's just not a lot of data in resistance training and how you may be able to use HRV as a tool to guide your training. So I'm consistently just experimenting with it. But it's pretty clear in the research that perceived levels of training load, RPE values, perceived levels of stress, fatigue, muscle soreness. Those things are worth tracking because they do correlate with other markers of fatigue and stress. That they're just non-invasive, they're easy to monitor, and you go with it. So I can't tell you not to monitor certain things because it's fun. It's fun to collect data. It's fun to experiment. So, but generally, if you're just in it to try and improve performance, you want to pick the variables that are the most meaningful to you, that are the most supported, and you need to be consistent with it.
Yeah. What other data metrics, biometrics do you track for your body on a routine basis besides HRV?
Well, I do again, perceived levels of fatigue, muscle soreness, all of that through the app. I'll do training load. Every now and then I'll calculate my tonnage, where I'll multiply, the weight I've used by the amount of sets and reps, and so forth, and see how that relates to my session rating of perceived exertion. If RPE is better relates to HRV, or if the tonnage value does. I don't do that all the time. It is time consuming to, do those calculations, but regularly I do my RPE for my workout. I'll do my perceived levels of fatigue and muscle soreness and so forth. And generally there's a comment section, so I'll usually make a note or two of something that happened the previous day. If I was out and I had a few drinks with some friends, I'll make a note, that I had a few drinks. If I'm traveling, when my training structure changed, things like that, I will make note of it. And I do keep a training log where I write down all my workouts and so forth. So there's plenty others that you can do. So
it sounds like you have a little diary kind of like related to stressors and health in general.
Yeah. And again, that's all stored right on the smartphone app that I use. Mm-hmm. The training log in my gym bag is just a little notebook where I log my workouts. I was going through a phase where I was looking at a reaction time test and a tap test, again on a with two different smartphone applications.
Yeah.
Honestly, I was doing it at a time where I was less familiar with certain statistical analyses, and I probably didn't really know how to analyze the data very well. But it's definitely something I've been interested in. There's some data to support that psychomotor speed assessed through a reaction time test can be related to fatigue and overtraining. So there's a smartphone app, I believe it's free, that the screen will prompt you to react to a light changing on the app. So as soon as the light turns green, you tap it, and then there's an unknown time interval where it'll then prompt you to tap it again over a series of 5 taps. Then it'll give you kind of the mean value of your reaction time. And I think the data is pretty cool that I've read and supports it. However, I haven't really seen any kind of longitudinal data where it's been done every day with athletes. So that's actually something I would actually like to include in a future study along with HRV and some other measures, this reaction time thing.
Yeah, great. There are a few of those apps, and I know that some of them are free because I downloaded and played around with them myself. But like you, I haven't really got into it. I played around with it once or twice. So yeah, thanks for all of this stuff, Andrew, man. This is very detailed. We've really done the topic of HRV justice, I think, really tackling it from every area. So thank you very much for your detailed explanations on everything.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for being interested and wanting to talk to me about it.
The Quantified Body.